Hey everybody, it's Julie and thanks for tuning into my channel. For today's video, I'm going to do something a little bit different. It's not going to be specifically writing instruction or information about publishing, but it'll be a little more about maybe inspiration for you. So a lot of people, when they find out that I'm a writer and they haven't been as successful with getting something started or being able to finish something, they ask for advice on working through writer's block and whatnot. And I don't usually have a great answer for that, but one thing that can help you to get excited about your projects again is to talk about them. And so if you have a blog or if you have some kind of place where you share information, you might consider doing the subject of this video, which is a 30-question blog survey. And you don't have to do it on a blog, but think about maybe answering these questions. I have 30 questions that you can think about with regard to your own writing. And if you don't have an answer or you don't like your answer, this may serve as an inspiration for you to think about maybe, do I want to have this question answered in something that I write, or do I want to address this, or hey, I never thought about that, maybe I should. So this is really just for fun, and I'm going to share with you a list of the 30 questions. And I'm also going to very briefly give you my answers to those 30 questions as well. So that you don't have to wait through the whole video to get the questions if that's what you're really here for. I'm just going to link to the whole list of the 30 questions, which is also on my writing blog, and you can get that in the info box of this video. So let's start with the first question. Question 1, tell us about your favorite writing project or favorite universe and why. My answer to this is a little bit complicated because, like you might imagine, most writers have a hard time picking a favorite. You know, it's like trying to pick a favorite child. But in my case, I think my favorite is definitely not the best one that I've written, but I really enjoy writing in a universe that's called The House That Ivy Built. And that's partly because, you know, it's been a part of my life since 1996, and after I wrote several novels in this universe and kind of decided that it wouldn't really survive as a publishable novel or novel series, I developed it into a webcomic, and I still write that webcomic every week, and it's a lot of fun. It's hard to verbalize exactly why I'm so attached to it, but I think it has something to do with the fact that it really doesn't have much of a plot. It's all about the characters, and I haven't compromised anything to try to make it more marketable, so it's just a lot of fun to focus on the everyday lives of the characters. Question 2, what gender do you prefer to have as a protagonist? And if you have no preference, which gender do you most often use as a protagonist? My answer to this is predictable. Most of my protagonists have been female, and it's kind of obvious to me that it's a familiarity issue. I struggle less with writing a female perspective for obvious reasons. I have written men characters and boy characters, but it just seems like that's one less thing that I have to worry about whether the perspective is appropriate for the gender if I write a female character. So that's my answer to that one. Question 3, how do you come up with names, both for your characters and for the places in your stories? My answer to that is pretty complicated because the answer will vary depending on which project I'm talking about, but a fair number of mine are just what popped into my head when I decided to create the character. In some cases, I will have to think about what their culture is and kind of do some research, or if it's a fictional culture, then maybe, like in my case, I have one of my books is about fairies, and the fairies tend to have nature-oriented names more often than the humans in the book do. So there were a lot of the fairies in my story, probably about half of them had some kind of nature-related name. As for places, I'm not very good at this either, but I usually set things in the real world, and maybe I'll make a fictional city or something so that I'm not setting it in a specific place and I get to create certain details that may not actually match any place in reality. But I really just pull them out of nowhere most of the time, just things that sound good to me. But when it does matter to match a person's last name with their heritage or something, I always do my research. Question 4. Tell us about one of your first stories or characters. In my case, I guess my first novel that I wrote when I was 14 was called Double Vision, and it was about a girl who had a twin brother, and they went to a strange school where they had to investigate the mystery of what was going on before they were harmed by what the authorities in the school wanted to do. It was a very silly book, and it was kind of a rip-off of several things that I liked, but it was my first novel, and it'll always have a special place in my heart, even though it's really awful. Question 5. Who is your youngest character by age, and who is your oldest? And how about in terms of when you created them, who's youngest and who's oldest? In my case, my youngest character has to be a character that I wrote about from before she was born, because I wrote about her mother being pregnant with her and then later transferred some of the story perspective to her after she was born, and that was my webcomic character Ivy. Protagonist-wise, my oldest character is probably Delia from Bad Fairy. She does live a very long time in the entire trilogy. If you get to the end, you kind of find out how long she's been around. But if I'm not restricted to talking about protagonists, I did write a short story character who was like 40,000 years old one time. So that person probably counts as my oldest character. My youngest character in terms of when we've written them, which would make her my newest character, is probably Megan from the novel that I'm writing right now, which is tentatively titled Ace of Arts. And some of the other characters that are in that story are technically newer than her, but protagonist-wise, Megan is my newest character. And my oldest is probably the time I tried to write a novel when I was in elementary school and I had a protagonist named Michelle, so we won't talk about that though. Question 6. Where are you most comfortable writing, and at what time of day do you write? And do you use a computer or good old pen and paper? My answer is I usually like to write on the computer sitting at my desk. I tend not to like to write on a laptop. And I write at various times of the day, but I do tend to be a night owl, so most of my writing is probably done in the wee hours. And I have some projects that I prefer to write in longhand, but it's become a lot more rare lately, and I almost entirely use the computer for my writing. Question 7. Do you listen to music while you write, and if so, what kind? And do you associate any particular songs or types of music with any of your projects or your characters? My answer to this is I do not listen to music while I write. I am too distracted by music to be able to write, so I'm one of those authors who needs complete silence to get anything done. But I absolutely do like to associate music with characters, and all of my major projects have extensive playlists that I have compiled to represent them or have some kind of inspiration associated with them, so I will share a few of those for you here.
Filled with self-belief, I'm haunted by self-doubt. I've got all the answers, I've got nothing figured out. I like to be
know there's something bigger out there. I wanna know, can you show me? I wanna know about these strangers like me. Tell me more, please.
Don't you see that? The candles burned out long ago. Now I'm as cold as outside. I tried to be your friend, but you just threw it all away. Is this what I get?
spending so much time underground. I guess my eyes adjusted to the lack of light. I got covered in darkness, covered in darkness. Ever wonder why I never really truly connect? Although my eyes are open, I can hold your gaze, but I'm never connected, never connected.
Wrap life in the brilliance of death to humble us all. How sweet is the day, I'm craving a darkness as I sit tucked away with my back to the wall. And the taste of dried up hopes in my mouth, and the landscape of a merry and desperate drought. How much longer, dear angels, that will my mind and dare you to follow? Paint a portrait of my mystery. Only close my eyes and you are here with me. A nameless face to think I see, to sit and watch the waves with me till they're gone. A heart I swear I'd recognize is made out of my own devices. Could I be wrong? Short nights, long dreams, something happens in between. Then I wake feeling like you're here, but still you're gone. Ooh, heartbeats like a knock on the door, but it sounds so far away, nearby. Can you hear me call out? Such a peculiar girl, and my dreams and thoughts in another world. But I live my life so lost in time, so lost in space, to belong to an unknown human race. But I live my life.
Truth be told, my problems all to me, the world to me, but you'll never know. You could be cruel to me. Why go risking the way that I see you? But then you'll always go and make me smile. I know you've been hurt before, but babe, I'm not from that world. I like to watch you end in mine, the only one I desire. So why you all insecure when what we have here is so pure?
You're losing me, why don't you just
Have you ever hated yourself for staring at the phone? Your whole life waiting on the ring to prove you're not alone. Have you ever been touched so gently you had to cry?
Question 8. What is your favorite genre to write? And what is your favorite genre to read? My answer to both is I like to write and read science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction. Question 9. How do you get your ideas for your characters? Describe your process in creating them. I don't think I can really do justice to this question myself, because I feel more like I find them, like I'm digging around in a sandbox and sort of go to a sandbox that I know is a particular thing, and then I just kind of dig up what I find there. I think there are different answers to this for different projects for me. Like, I have written a fairy tale retelling, and that was a conscious choice to say, oh, I'm going to adapt this specific story to a different perspective of a character that doesn't get focused on in this fairy tale very often. And so, I mean, that was not as much of the sandbox thing, but for the most part, it's kind of like I'll just think about a concept, or I'll just get an idea like you get a dream, and you just slowly start building on it. And then all of a sudden there's somebody there to write about. And I find out the most about them while I'm actually writing them versus pre-writing in my head before I write it down. So I probably do it a little differently than people who take more time to plan, but that's that, and the interaction with the other characters is mostly how I find out who they are. Question 10. What are some really weird situations that your characters have been in? To be honest, I write a lot of really strange stuff, so pretty much everything I've written kind of falls into the weird category, but maybe I'll just share a single example from each of my major projects. From Bad Fairy, I would say, how about that my character convinced a queen that frogs were talking to her? From my book Finding Mulligan, my main character went to a dream world and defeated a monster that was made out of slime by making the clouds rain 2% milk. In my science fiction romance book Stupid Questions, the characters were discussing where they could go to buy condoms after church. And in my old series, The House That Ivy Built, just every part of it is weird. There was one time where my protagonist decided that her roommate needed to be annoyed, so she made a bunch of footprints on the ceiling just to piss her off. Question 11. Who is your favorite character to write and your least favorite, and why? For me, even after all this time, probably my favorite character to write is Ivy from my webcomic, and that's just partly because the way she thinks is so different from the way that most other people think that it's just really fun to visit that way of thinking and see how it comes out. Least favorite, I don't actively hate writing any of my characters, but I think my character Cassie from Finding Mulligan was one of the most difficult because she's kind of really focused on romance, and that was really hard for me to make seem convincing without making it annoying. I don't know how well I succeeded. And then maybe also Nick from Stupid Questions, because he's a guy, so that was already kind of a challenge for me, but he's also kind of an atypical guy, so it was a real challenge for me to balance his sensitivity with his masculinity and make it convincing. Question 12. Which of your stories do you think you did the best job world building, and do you have any neat side notes to share? For me, this is tough because even though I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer, I don't do a lot of world building. I usually set it in some version of modern times, but there have been a couple of exceptions. Notably, of course, Bad Fairy, my fairy tale retelling, is written in a kind of traditional sort of generic fantasy land. I don't actually think I did a fantastic job with the world building on this, but I think I did okay with the characters, like that I had a small but significant portion of the population is fairies in a world that's run by humans. And I think I came up with some pretty interesting ways for their magical schooling to work, and how they view each other and what their interactions are like between humans and fairies. So I think I did okay on that aspect of it, although the world around it is probably a little bit loose with the world building. I know that's something I have to work on. I did do a fair amount of world building for my comic, which is kind of funny because a lot of the world building just kind of got thrown out the window toward the beginning because of a plot element that happened. But I have kind of interdimensional travel going on, and there has been some limited world building, including some fake language that I had to create, like parts of a made-up language for this alternate world, where there are a lot of different types of creatures from different worlds kind of coexisting, and there's a prophet culture, and it's a very strange sort of thing that I had to come up with. It's not my usual jam, but usually, especially when it's an aspect of characters and everyday life, I tend to flesh it out pretty good, but only in the parts where it's relevant to the characters' everyday lives. I'm not usually one of those people who spends a lot of time filling in history and background details and stuff that doesn't apply to the characters as you see them in the story. So that's kind of one of the aspects of writing that I tend not to do very much of. Question 13, what is your favorite culture to write, fictional or not, and why? In my case, I guess the favorite culture I have has been for my Bad Fairy stories, the fairy culture. It's a really interesting dynamic where the main character is actually half fairy and half human, so she's always going to have kind of a unique perspective on it. She's always going to see both of them from somewhat of an outsider perspective, and that gave me a unique opportunity to explore both of them. In the society in my Bad Fairy stories, there is a tendency for the fairies to find their meaning and their fulfillment from working for humans. And this is not just a cultural thing, but something that they actually just inherently enjoy doing. And that's part of what makes the fairies, who have magic and have more power than the humans in that respect, it keeps them kind of from overthrowing the humans and being evil overlords. So there's sort of a compulsion that they have to use it for helping out society and deriving their life fulfillment from that. And it's kind of shamed if that is not something that you're doing with your life. So and my main character, being only half fairy, she only experiences that compulsion kind of on a lesser level, but she does experience it, and then sort of the human part of her does not like it very much. She finds it sort of demeaning that she wants to work for other people and be subservient to them, so she's very conflicted about that, and I find it really interesting to write about it from having the character being raised primarily in the fairy culture. She mostly experiences like a lot of expectations from authority figures who expect her to have certain reactions and desires that she doesn't have, or doesn't have as strongly as they do. So that's a really kind of intriguing aspect of the story that I really like writing about. Question 14, how do you map out locations, and do you have any illustrations to show us? I really hate maps. I'm not very good at following maps in the real world, so I tend not to map out physical locations in my stories very well either. But there have been a couple cases where I mapped out an architectural layout for a house so that I could figure out, kind of in a college dorm situation, where the characters are living, which character has which room and who's next to who. So I have sort of a map of that. And for my webcomic, I did have sort of a key to who can travel from what dimension to what dimension in the dimensional travel aspect of the story. So that was kind of necessary, and it's not complicated or involved at all, but it is sort of a map, so okay, I'll count that. Question 15, a halfway question here. Tell us about a writer you admire and why. My answer to this would probably be Shannon Hale. I really like how she tends to write these epic plots where there's these world-shaking consequences and huge stakes in her stories, but she still manages to make the stories very personal. She tends to focus small, even though she's got a clearly big world, and I wish that I was better at that, but I just really enjoy watching the way that she executes these huge things that are happening in the characters' worlds and still manages to make them relatable to somebody who's never been through something like that, and make it feel like it's really happening to a person, and all of the feelings that a person has when they're dealing with something really big happening in their world. Question 16, do you write romantic relationships? How do you do with that, and how far are you willing to take them? In my case, I don't know that it's really one of my strong points in writing, for kind of obvious reasons, because I'm an aromantic person, but I do live in a society that is kind of saturated with romance, so I've seen all the tropes. I know all the people around me tend to experience romance, so I don't feel like it's a particularly hard thing to write either, but unless I wanted to write a bunch of stories that were all kind of about derivatives of me, I do understand that for the most part characters are probably going to have romance as part of their lives, and so yes, I do tend to write characters who fall in love, and I think I do okay at it. I don't tend to write stories that specifically focus only on that, but I think I do okay with their interaction if they have a romance. As far as how far will I write, I mean, I don't write erotica, I don't write sex scenes exactly, although I've written a couple implied sex scenes, but, I'm willing to write stories where it is heavily implied or described that characters go to bed together and have sexual intercourse or have intimate relationships with each other. So I don't find that to be uncomfortable, but again, I'm not writing explicit things or things that are designed to be titillating, so I don't think that I would write those kinds of scenes, but I don't tend to write stories that are focusing on that aspect of a relationship, so it's not because I couldn't do it, it's just that I don't write stories that do that. Question 17, your favorite protagonist and why? This is really impossible to answer, I think, but I really don't have a favorite, but I can ramble a little bit about my favorite protagonists in two of my major projects, I guess. I really love Delia from Bad Fairy, but I kind of hate her as much as I love her. Part of that is because she's so intense to write. She's very different from me, and so she's very dramatic, and that can be really fun, but I think she would be exhausting to be around, actually. So, like, as a person, I don't know how much I really like her. Her ego is kind of out of control. She's got some elitism problems, but at the same time, it's hard not to care about what happens to her when you see the kind of loneliness and the kind of alienation she deals with. And I also personally relate to her desire for greatness and her desire to really change the world with her ideas. So, but the other protagonist that gives her a run for her money for favorite protagonist is, of course, again, Ivy from the webcomics that I write and the House That Ivy Built stories. Part of that is I really like her sort of balancing act between the sky and the ground, so to speak, and that she's not a particularly intelligent character, but she can sort of be wise, which is also interesting to write because I do tend to write kind of intelligent characters, and Ivy is really not, so that's kind of a change for me. I really like that she explores this strange sort of vulnerability with being the most powerful person in the room. That's a very odd dynamic to write, but she's very sort of sensitive about some odd things and has very mixed feelings and is very inconsistent, just like real people are, so I really enjoy writing that, and I think she's one of the most multifaceted characters that I've ever made. So she might have to be my answer if I said favorite protagonist. Question 18, favorite antagonist and why? This is again a difficult question for me because I tend not to have actual villains in my stories. I don't have like a big bad, but even though most of my conflict in my stories are kind of man versus self sorts of conflicts, I do have characters who have enemies. And Bad Fairy is a good example of that because my main character Delia has a rivalry, a sort of extended feud with one of her classmates who is named Beatrice, and I think she might have to count as my favorite antagonist, partly because I thought a lot about her motivation while I was writing the Bad Fairy series, and Beatrice really clearly thinks that she's right, and she's not just a jerk because my story needed a jerk. She has a philosophical position that causes her to be in opposition to my character. And even though she kind of provided a lot of the conflict for their interpersonal feud here, she also sort of helped my character get grounded in her perspective by being so grounded in her own. And even though I do ultimately kind of show that the antagonist, Beatrice, is, for the most part, she's wrong about what she believes, because part of it is grounded in bigotry and refusal to consider outside perspectives. But at the same time, she does have a point about some of the things that she says to my protagonist, and they are things that she does eventually have to learn, which she was unable to learn because of pride at the time that it was presented to her. Question 19. Who's your favorite minor character who decided to shove themselves into the spotlight, and why? I have a couple answers to this yet again. In my story, Bad Fairy, I originally wrote what is now a trilogy as just one huge book, and originally my protagonist's study partner, Fiona, was sort of a throwaway character. She was mentioned a couple of times, but in the rewrites she became really important, and I really love Fiona. She got such a great personality. She got a well-developed personality that did sort of a good job letting my protagonist bounce some of her feelings off of her, and allowing her to have somebody in her life who wasn't a negative influence, who still nevertheless did not truly understand her all the way. So I really like Fiona. And then in my webcomic, I have a lot of background characters, but I was actually really surprised by some of the commenters and the fans of the webcomic, how positively they reacted to one of my background characters, who is an alien named Chelsea, and she's sort of enthusiastic and has a lot of energy and is even sort of sarcastic, but she's kind of bubbly, and I don't write a lot of characters like that in this story. The story's kind of a downer sometimes in the webcomic -1. There's a lot of sad stuff, there's a lot of slow-moving stuff, so I guess maybe the fans who read it just really liked the break of having a funny character and humor sometimes. So she's completely written out of the story now. There's no real possible way for her to come back, so nobody has seen Chelsea for years, but I still get comments about people liking her, so I kind of caught some of that enthusiasm, and I really like her too when I've seen other people's reactions to her, so that's my answer to that one. Question 20. What are your favorite kind of character interactions to write? Like, do you like to write love scenes or brawls or arguments? I think my answer to this, I love dialogue, but I especially like when two characters are discussing something where maybe there's a moral dilemma or like a personal problem that one of them has, and the other character is sort of maybe older or wiser or in a mentorship kind of situation where they're trying to sort of gently lead the other person to realizing something important or offer comfort or something like that. I also especially like when there's a reversal, like when the one you think is there to learn is the one that ends up doing the teaching, maybe accidentally. But I really love interactions between teachers and students, or between best friends, or between mothers and daughters. I love writing scenes like that. Question 21. Do any of your characters have children, and how comfortable do you feel writing about them? I do have a few characters who are parents. As a person who has not had children and does not intend to have children, I can't really tell you, I guess, how accurate my portrayal of being a parent is. But I have had encouraging comments from people who think that I do a good job writing parent characters. My webcomic -1 has one of the major protagonists, especially toward the beginning, is a woman named Mary Lynn, who her first entry in the story is when she finds out that she's going to become a mother. So I've actually written a very explicit story about her journey through motherhood and pregnancy, birth, and then raising a child. And I actually had people commenting, thinking that I was writing from personal experience with that. So I guess at least in those people's case, they thought that I did a good job writing these parent characters. I've definitely written some other less traditional parent-child relationships as well. I've written situations where I have a character who is sort of a surrogate mother to another character. And also in the webcomic, my other protagonist toward the beginning, named Adele, she has a biological mother, but her teacher is more like her mother, so that's been a really interesting relationship to write. And several other characters that I've written have relationships with their children that maybe are unusual or noteworthy, but those are the major ones. Question 22. Tell us about one scene that you haven't written yet or haven't told anybody about yet. Tell us about your secret scene. This is a tough one for me because I don't do a lot of mental writing, pre-writing before I write it down, and then usually shortly after I've written these things I'm sharing them with people. But I guess I'll go with something that I haven't written yet but have thought about. In the book that I, as of this recording, am currently writing, which is called Ace of Arts, my protagonist is planning to explore relationships with some people, and as such she hasn't even met the person yet that I'm going to write this scene with, but I've imagined a scene with my protagonist going to the playground at night with another character that she will meet in a school organization, and maybe talking about some of their past relationships with men. And these are both female characters where they're going to be exploring whether they have an attraction to each other. So I'm looking forward to writing that, and it's going to be confusing, and I don't think I even know who the other character is yet. I don't know her name. I may have named her in some notes somewhere, but I'm going to figure that out. But I definitely see this as happening on a playground at night, and that's going to be an interesting sort of scene to write. Question 23. How long does it usually take you to write an entire story from the time you start it to the time that you send it in to wherever it's going to be, either posting it on the internet or submitting it to publication? My answer to that is quite variable, especially considering that I write stories of many different lengths. I write some short stories that might come out in a day, and I might submit them to a magazine like the next day. But then also novels. I tend to be a fast drafter if I'm actively working on the project, but in recent years I've taken a lot of breaks from active projects, so I guess I'm not really that fast of a drafter anymore. The fastest I ever wrote a story, a novel, was a 255,000 word book in 5 weeks. Or maybe the one that I wrote that ended up being 155,000 words in 2 weeks was actually faster, but I don't know if I should even count that one because I don't actually know how long the first draft was, because I wrote it by hand, and then when I typed it up into the computer, I think it got longer as I was typing it, so it's hard to really say. But I mean, I tend to be a really fast drafter if I'm actively working on a project, and you know, it's not unusual for me to write 8,000 words in a day. But like I said, I've been taking a lot more breaks lately, so overall I haven't been cranking them out as fast as I used to. Question 24. How willing are you to kill your characters if the plot demands it? And what's the most interesting way you've ever killed a character? I don't have a lot of character deaths in my stories, probably because there's not a lot of dramatic battles or anything like that, but I have had characters die, just not all that often. Hands down, probably the most interesting way that I've ever killed somebody was in a short story once. A character died because the person he was talking to whacked him over the head with a stick and set him on fire. Question 25. Do any of your characters have pets? Tell us about those. I don't write a lot of animals. It's probably just a personal preference that I just don't really get on board with this animal-human camaraderie, I guess. But I do have a partially finished novel where an elementary school kid who's like, I guess he's like 11 or 12, is really into animals, and he loves taking care of animals. And he has a pet bunny and he has a pet dog. And I try to write those realistically because there's a lot of kids who are just like really into their pets, and this kid is one of those. But for the most part, I don't write a lot of people-animal relationships. Question 26. Do you ever draw your characters, or do others draw them? Or have you ever made like a digital avatar of any of your characters? If so, show them to us. I do this a lot. I am not what I consider to be like an accomplished or educated or particularly good artist, but I really enjoy drawing, and I do actually tend to use drawing sometimes to figure out what characters look like, maybe define their more specific features. So I tend to use drawing as a way to figure out kind of the physical aspects of them that I haven't already imagined. So yes, I draw my characters, and I have quite a few examples of those. Question 27. Do appearances play a big role in your stories, and how do you go about designing your characters? I would say for me, I probably don't focus on appearance as much as maybe some other authors do. I literally have characters that I've never physically described, even if they're the protagonist, although that's not really the norm for me either. But I'm not a very visual person, I guess, so I don't focus on the physical aspect of people. I will tend to focus more on how they talk, or what their accent is, or what their manner of speech, the figures of speech that they use. I'll focus a lot more on that than I will on what they look like, but I know that that's an important aspect of who they are. I tend to be less symbolic with the choices that I make about characters unless I'm writing a really symbolic story. In my fairy tale retelling, Bad Fairy, I felt like since I was retelling a fairy tale, I needed to use a lot of archetypes. So I have a protagonist who is often mistaken for being evil, and I gave her long black hair and pale skin, and that's like really traditional, and I did that on purpose. But other than that, I don't tend to focus on choosing specific physical aspect of characters to indicate anything about who they are. But of course, I know that it's important to write characters who have an opinion about their own appearance. So I have some characters who go through stuff that's self-conscious, or I do have a character who spends a big chunk of her narrative transforming her physical appearance so that she can look the way that she looks in a dream world. So that's kind of something that I focus on a lot in that story, where she'll go to great lengths to change the way that her hair looks and the way that she dresses, and then she'll spend a lot of focus on how she's perceived differently because of these changes that she's made. So, there are times that I will focus on it, but I'm more likely to have the protagonist focusing on how other people look than on how they themselves look. So maybe that's something important too. Question 28. Have you ever written a character with physical or mental disabilities? And if so, describe those. I've definitely done this, a fair amount actually. In my webcomic I have a couple of examples. I have an autistic character. She does speak, but she usually is just repeating what somebody else says. She doesn't have a lot of speech. Then I have a character who has epilepsy, although it's mentioned a couple of times, but it's never actually, like, it's not a plot point or anything. It's an aspect of the character that is integral to her and what has happened in her life, but it's never kind of on screen. And I guess it counts that the protagonist of one of the storylines in the webcomic, Ivy herself, has kind of a minor physical malformation. She doesn't have pinky fingers or pinky toes, and that's it ends up being commented upon now and then in her life, and it causes her minor inconveniences sometimes. My protagonist in Finding Mulligan, Cassie, she could probably be classified as mentally ill, but that's really complicated, so I will refrain from being really specific about that. I have a story called Protector, where the protagonist has a severe short-term memory loss, and he can't remember really anything from minute to minute. He's kind of living in an ever-changing now, and that's a pretty severe one. I have an odd short story called, right now it's called That Story About Fortune Cookie Girl, and the protagonist's fiance has ADHD. In one of my short stories called Your Terms, I have a character with severe agoraphobia. I have a character named Jessie in The House That Ivy Built who's really severely dyslexic. And I have another dyslexic character, although this character, Mars, she doesn't have quite a severe case of it, but she's in a story that I haven't finished. I don't know now if I will, but a novel I started writing called Joint Custody. I wrote a short story called Her Mother's Child, where the main character is a mother who has lost her ability to speak. It's not specified what this disorder is, what happened to her, but it's kind of implied that she had a physical problem where she used to be able to speak and now she can't speak, so she uses a combination of gestures and handwriting to communicate. And there are some characters later on in the Bad Fairy series who have various disabilities. Mostly the ones that I focus on are cognitive disabilities. I write a character who has essentially Down syndrome, even though the syndrome itself is not called that in this universe, of course, because it would have to be named after the person who named that. So but that's the disorder that I mention, and there's a few other situations that I kind of gloss over and talk about in the future of the series, where I talk about cognitive disabilities and people who got institutionalized in the story, that the main character doesn't like the treatment that they get in this pseudo-medieval world. Question 29. How often do you think about writing, and do you ever come upon people or situations that remind you in the real world of something that is in your writing? I doubt there's a writer alive who doesn't encounter people and situations that they feel mirrors something that they've written in their books or something that reminds them of their characters, but yeah, that does happen to me, and sometimes I talk to other people about stuff that's happened in my work as if it's something that really happened to someone. Oh, that reminds me of something so-and-so did, and it's not a real person. I would say I think about writing pretty frequently. It depends on how distracted I am with real life, but there are a lot of those moments in the shower, moments before you're falling asleep, where I'm just chewing on a story, so I think that's pretty typical. And question 30, the final question. These surveys always seem to do this. They say tag somebody and say what you like about that person as a writer. Obviously I don't really want to tag anybody specific in the video version of this. When I did it on my blog, I did tag someone and discuss that, but I'm tagging you guys, so remember you can use this survey on your own blogs if you want to use it as a way of springboarding and talking about your writing, or you can just use some of these questions like, you know, stuff about do you write parents, do you write people with disabilities, what about characters' pets and whatnot, and think about your answers and why you answer the way that you do and whether you'd like to be able to answer differently in 5 years. So that about wraps this one up, and I hope you have enjoyed going through these questions and thinking about them for your own work. See you next time.